This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. I recently put out a video talking about how I edit color in my images and using curves and HSL sliders, how I dial in the correct color mix that I want to see. And some of you have asked the question, how do you do the same sort of thing but for your video work? And some of you have also commented and said that the videos that I produce have a particular kind of look to them. So today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about how I color grade my videos. I don't usually spend a lot of time on video on this channel. I've just been talking about photography really, but there's absolutely no reason why I'm not happy to spend time talking about video as well. So if that's something you're keen on and you'd like me to spend more time on, leave some comments below, let me know, or send me a message on some of my other social channels and give me specific questions you'd like me to spend time on, and I'd be happy to do that. Now, I'm not a professional colorist by any stretch, but I'll show you some of the simple techniques I used when I'm grading my footage. Some things you should know is I always shoot on a flat picture profile on my cameras. I use Canon DSLRs for most of my video work, although I mix in GoPro footage and drones every now and again. I'm trying to get the flattest profile I can. I use Technicolor CineStar when I film, or I've got some of the logs that James Miller's put out, which sort of imitate Canon C-Log for your DSLRs. And all that does is gives me a little bit more cheated dynamic range in terms of the footage that I'm using. For most of the videos you see on this channel, I use Final Cut Pro X on my iMac. I find it a very speedy editing program, but the color board which you use to color grade is terrible. I'm going to show you how to use that. I've also got some extra plugins which help with color grading, and I'll show you some of those as well. I also use Premiere Pro a lot, which I find the color grading in Premiere Pro with Lumetri Color is a lot easier to use. It's a lot more intuitive, and I really enjoy that. But if you want a free option that is amazing, take a look at DaVinci Resolve. It's a free download, and you get 99% of the program. There's some extra little things you get, like noise reduction if you want the pro version, but the free version gives you most of the editing program, and the color grading tools in that are industry standard. They really are brilliant. I'm going to take you through 3 basic steps for color grading. The first one is going to be your primary grade, which is just the whole image where you dial in the correct amount of brightness and contrast, and you make sure your colors are correct. The secondary grade is going to be where you might play or tweak with particular colors in the image, and maybe you want to highlight a particular area of the image with a window. I'll show you how to do that. And then the last step is going to be to create the look for your image, which is going to be like your mastering. I'll also show you how to create your own LUT in Photoshop. LUT just stands for lookup table, and that's going to be a collection of data. It's just a small file that you're going to apply over your whole image, which is going to bring all your shots together into one piece, and it's going to give all your footage and your whole video a look, and that's going to be your mastering stage. So let's jump right in. Okay, so I'm inside Final Cut Pro 10. And I've just imported onto a timeline 6 shots from the last video that I put out there. And these are all just raw, straight out of camera, nothing done to them yet. They're just as shots. So you can see, looking at the footage, how kind of gray and washed out it is, not a lot of contrast, not a lot of color. And what that's doing is it's protecting my highlights and also helping me keep my shadow detail. Just remember that when you're shooting with flat picture profiles, on DSLRs, especially the Canon DSLRs, it's definitely a good way to keep that dynamic range, but you now have to be careful in this stage because you're not working with RAW files or great video codecs that you can pull a long way and the image will hold up. If you pull them too far, they will start to break apart and band, so you do need to be careful of that when you're going through. So just one at a time. I'm going to move fairly quickly so this video isn't too long, and I'm going to show you my process for grading footage. So you can see these 6 shots here. Basically what I want to do is my effects panel on the right, which you just click this little icon here, it pops everything out. And I'm going to show you using the built-in color board, color corrector. So I'm just taking color correction, dragging it straight on top of the clip. And this is the built-in color correction tool that Final Cut Pro X has. Personally, as I said, I'm not a massive fan, but I want to show you how to do this. If you have Final Cut Pro 10, you don't have any plugins, it is still possible. And what I'm going to do on each of these shots so far, just to get started, is that primary color grade we spoke about. So I'm looking at the overall image and I want to dial in the right amount of contrast that I want to see and make sure the color is, broadly speaking, correct. That's my first stage on each of these clips. So you can imagine at the moment what I'd normally be looking at is a complicated kind of timeline here, all my video built out. I do all the building first. These are just 6 clips in a row, but normally it would be audio files underneath here and extra video files and text files on top. Once I've built out my structure, this is the stage where I'll get to the correction, the color correction. So first thing I want to do is go up here to Window, Workspaces, and I want to go to Color and Effects. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring up my scopes. Now, I generally change my view to just side by side. On the left, I usually put my waveform, and on the right, I put my vector scope, and I'll show you why in a minute. And usually I just create a little more space for my my waveform, my RGB parade, than I do for my vector scope, and I'll show you what this is for in a minute. So what this is showing you is in your red, your green, and your blue channels, this is showing you how much luminance you have in each, okay? So 0 here is black. Anything under 0 means you have totally lost the detail in that, it's just gone to pure black, anything that sits under 0. And similarly, anything that goes above 100 is blown totally to white, which means you've lost all the detail in that. Within the image here, the way this works is from left to right on each of these channels is left to right on this picture. So you can see there's more luminance on the left-hand side here because there's more luminance on the left of the picture. And if I scrub through, you can see how it moves on the waveform. You can see what I'm talking about from left to right. Similarly, it jumps across here. You can see this is the cross right here on this, just on the near left-hand side there. So as I scrub through, you can see if we move to a shot of me talking here, you can see me moving around in that part there. You can see this is my head on each of those. So from left to right, that's how you read those scopes. And obviously, if there's a lot more, it looks like there's a lot more red in the image, but that makes perfect sense because obviously it's a warm sunrise. So what you're looking at is good. If it's a good way to check sometimes if you've got a color cast in your image. If one of these are boosted, like if there's a lot of green in here and not much red and blue, it means you've got a green color cast to your image. You can see this one's fairly well balanced. This one's quite orangey red, but it should be because it's the sunrise. That one's fairly well balanced, fairly well balanced. So, and the rest makes sense. So this is just a way for you to see kind of, do you have any color cast in your image and making sure it makes sense. So with this first clip selected now, I'm just going to click on this little arrow icon next to color board, and this will open up my color board. And the way this works in 3 panels, the first panel is your exposure, your second panel here is your saturation, and your third is your color, okay? So the way that I normally work is I'll start with my exposure and get that correct. I only generally use 2 sliders, and the first is my global slider. This changes the exposure of the entire image, and my mid slider. So this just affects the exposure of the midtones, okay? So I might tweak my highlights and shadows, but generally if I can get away without using those, it's better because the image stands less chance of breaking apart. So taking my global slider and watching my, my RGB parade on this side, I want to push my global exposure so that it's coming right near the top there, but I don't want to touch 100. Often I'm aiming for around 95 in my head. And then I'm taking my midtone slider and dragging that down, and this will create contrast. But I don't want, again, I don't want this touching anywhere near 0, okay? Now that's looking fairly good. Now I might want to take the shadows and just pull them down a little bit just to create that little extra bit of crunch, and then just my highlights just a little touch up there. So now that's looking fairly good to me. So if I come back here and I turn this on and off, you can see the contrast. I've just added back some contrast, quite subtle, not too heavy. Okay, now in my saturation, generally what I want to do is I want to desaturate my highlights slightly. I usually just automatically put in -5 and -5 on my shadows. In cinema, when you look at images, what they've often done in their color grade is they've desaturated highlights and shadows and just kept the midtones quite rich and vibrant. So that's a little trick I like to do. I'll often push back in a slight bit of global saturation just because I know that the picture profiles I use do tend to pull out some of that color detail, but you need to be quite careful with that. On this image, it doesn't need too much, obviously, because it is quite a rich sky. Now in my color palette here, similarly, you've got your global, which is going to affect the whole look globally. So that's just pushing green into my global image. Set that back to 0, and then you've got your shadows and your midtones and your highlights. So what you can do here, and I generally don't do this because I find this a little bit clunky and you have to make very tiny moves to make this make sense, but say I want to push in some oranges into the highlights. So if I pull this over here and just drag slightly up into the highlights, let's make this 5. So you can see anything above the line means I'm adding the color on this spectrum. So I'm here in the oranges, pushing it slightly above the line. And anything I want to take out, I'm going to drag below the line. So if I pull down on my mids here, I'm taking out cyan, which is having the effect of adding orange in. So let's take that back to 0 again. If I want to take my shadows now, potentially what I might want to do just to opposite out and give your teal and orange look is bring it over to my teals and push some sort of teals into those shadows, okay? Now, this is okay. Generally, I don't really want to do too much of this at this stage. And the reason for that is that the primary grade should just be about, for me, correcting my contrast and exposure and just making sure that the colors are correct. I don't want to stylize at the moment. And with that in mind, I'm going to set these back to 0. What we're going to do is we're going to introduce our color look with our LUTs later. Okay, now let's move quite fast. So this one's looking fairly good. Moving straight on to my next image. Make sure it's selected. We're here in the color panel. Let's go to exposure. Same thing again. I'm watching my scopes on the left here. So I'm going to push my global exposure up. I don't want it to touch 100 or come too close. Taking my midtones and dragging those down to create the contrast that I want in that image. And that's looking fairly good. I don't mind that it's quite dark and moody. You know, I want this silhouette of the cross and the little church, and I want this sky to look really good. So I might bring my highlights down a touch because I can see this is quite close to blowing out. And then I might just drop the shadows a touch to create a bit more contrast. I'm going to go into my saturation. I'm going to boost up my saturation quite a bit on this one because it is looking quite washed out. So maybe let's go to 20 and see what that does. Maybe it's a little much. So I'm going to dial that back to 16, 17. Shadows again, I'm going to go -5, and highlights I'm going to go -5. So it's going to keep my midtones saturated and just desaturate my highlights and shadows. Okay, again, I'm not going to touch the color board. We're going to come to that later. So you can see that's looking sort of, I'm scrubbing backwards and forwards between clips the whole time to make sure that I'm dialing in similar amounts of contrast and saturation. Let's go again, exposure, watching my parade on the left here. I'm going to push my global. Yep, that's looking pretty good. Don't touch 100, stay below and take my midtones and drag them down. Okay, now this one I can already tell is going to be muddy unless I take my shadows down as well. So I'm going to pull my shadows slightly. It's going to be quite a tricky one. It's going to be quite a fine line. And because there's so much here, there's so much dark shadow in the bottom here, and there's so much sort of bright highlight on these clouds, it means it is going to be quite a moody image, which I'm fine with. I'm going to push my global back up again just to create a little bit more contrast, and then my mids down a bit. Okay, and that's looking fairly good. Saturation, I'm going to boost this back up to, yeah, let's try 18, and then shadows. I'm going to leave them on this one because it's still looking quite desaturated globally. I'm going to push that even more, and that's looking fairly good. On this one, I'm going to go into color, and I'm just going to warm up my midtones a little bit just to match with what I've been doing, what the other ones look like already. So probably just 2. Let's just try 2 there, just into those warm, sort of warm oranges. That's looking fairly good. I'm scrubbing backwards and forwards. Those are looking fairly similar. If I turn this on and off, you can see what I've done on this. It's quite a big difference. And this is just your primary, remember, this is just your primary grade. And this one here, you can see quite a big difference. Okay, so let's move on. And I've just pulled in a clip of me talking here. And the reason for this is where your vector scope comes into play. So your vector scope works that you've got your reds, magentas, blues, cyans, greens, and yellows. That's your color circle. And this line that appears on here is your skin tone line. So a great way to check if your skin tones are looking good and they're looking natural is to make sure that your color sits on that skin tone line. And if you want to do this properly, I found the best way to do it is to take your scale in your transform panel here and to dial it right in like this. So push it right, let's take it to 600, okay? And then on my X and Y, I'm just going to line myself up so that I am So there's lots of skin tone in the frame. Okay, so I've filled the screen with mostly skin tone. Now I know that anything on this line here is going to be my skin tone line, and I can already see that my skin tones are in the correct place. So say if I drag my color correction on top here, if I have a color cast or something weird about the image when I was recording, if my white balance was incorrect and it was slightly too blue, you can see what would happen with this line. It would be all over the place, and that's where I need to come into my color, and I need to get my color correct before I want to start pushing my colors all over the place. So I can set this back to 0 because I was in the right place. Again, where you want to be is your midtones. This will be where your skins live. So you can see I could have it all over the place, but it needs to be that I'm tweaking around until my skin tone lies from the center directly on this line, and then I've got a good healthy skin tone. Okay, so if I jump back out, if I set this to 100 again, and set this to 0, and this to 0, back where I should be. And now on my color board, same process again, watching my RGB parade, I'm pushing my highlight or my global exposure up, watching these little pieces here. I don't really want them touching 100, and then I'm going to take my midtones and drag those down to add my contrast back in. Maybe a little touch with the shadows to pull down, and a little touch with the highlights. I don't really want to do that because it's starting to touch 100. So again, let's just bring this down a touch. Great. So if I turn this on and off, I can see I made a big difference there. Come back to my color board again. I might want to push just a touch of color in. So just 5 on this one, -5 on my shadows. And this is just a rule I use just because I know it gives that slightly cinematic feel. -5 on my highlights. And that's looking fairly good. If I want to check again that nothing I've done here has affected those skin tones again, same process, I can just zoom right in and dial it over until my face fills the screen and make sure that it's lying on this skin tone line. But I know from working on this already that that's pretty good. So let's have a look, just scrubbing backwards and forwards. Yep, I think I can dial in even more in the blacks, in the shadows in this, because looking at the other ones I have more contrast. So making sure my exposure is selected, I can pull down the blacks on this as well, and then it's going to match slightly better. Let's pull up that global exposure a little bit, and the midtones down to create a bit more contrast. So cycling backwards and forwards. It's obviously different light when I started recording that, but it's fine. The contrast to me looks pretty similar. Okay, let's do this one quickly with this grass. You can see it's nice and gray. I've kept a lot of that detail just by using that flat picture profile. Exposure, I'm going to start pushing up until it's close to 100. Gone a little too far there. Close to 100 on my RGB, and then taking my midtones and pulling them way down. So there, maybe my shadows a little touch, and push my highlights a little bit. Okay, and this one I want to saturate, push in some saturation. Yeah, I can go 17 on this one. And again, this is up to preference, so it's however you want to dial that in. I'm not going to mess with color here. I think it looks pretty good. So I'm dialing backwards and forwards and looking around. Have I got things looking similar? Yes, 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 yes. Okay, I think it looks pretty good. And coming across to my last image, again, I want to check my RGB parade. I've got a lot of space on this one, but I do need to be careful with this. I'm going to push my exposure on global to sort of the middle here. And then I'm going to start to bring my midtones down. This will take a few moves to get the contrast baked in correctly. Push again on my global, and then push again, pull it down on my midtones. Okay, that's looking fairly good. This is already introducing more saturation because of how much contrast I'm pushing in. A little touch on the highlights, not too much, and I think I'm going to just dial a little bit on the shadows as well. So that you can see, I don't want any more saturation in this, and I will pull down my shadows and my highlights again. The interesting thing about pulling in contrast is it does create more saturation in your image visually as well, so you have to sort of balance it out with everything else. Again, if I turn this on and off, you can see how much it's brought back. Okay, so quick scan through on my primary grade, and I feel like these are looking fairly similar now. So early morning, brightening up a little more, quite a lot brighter on the beach, and some grass, and that's looking fairly good. So that's it for my primary grade. When it comes to the secondary grade, this isn't necessarily something I do with every clip, but especially interviews, it's definitely a good idea. And what I'm doing here is I'm color correcting and changing exposure on areas of the image rather than the image as a whole. So if I drag color correction on top of this clip again, it creates a second color correction. And I'm going to click on this little mask icon here. And what that's going to do is it's going to add a shape mask over the image. And if I drag this out over my face here, and this outer circle determines how much it's feathered from the center circle to outside. So I want quite a nice feather. Let's pull it out a little bit more. And then when I hit inside my color board, I've got these options at the bottom for mask inside and outside. And what I want to do is I want to have outside selected, and I want to go to exposure, and I want to pull the midtones down outside of where I have things selected. And inside, I might just want to push up my highlights just a touch, and maybe the global, got to be careful with that because it starts to look misty, just a touch. And what that's going to do, if I go back outside, click off, so the mask is off here, and if I just deselect this one, you can see what I've done is I've just drawn your eye into my face here while I'm talking. So it's just a correction that's created a slight window, and because I'm not moving around too much, I can get away with just using this area. I've just created a window and drawn your eye to the brighter part of the image where I'm speaking, and just darken down some of these areas. Let's do one more quickly. So say I take this one, similar kind of thing, color correction on top. Here's my second board. If I go to shape mask again, if I drag, let's say on this one, I want to drag this across. I'm going to create a rectangle. This little light colored blob here actually changes it so you can square the edges. And I'm going to dial that out of screen, and I'm going to feather this off, and I'm going to push this right up here. What I could do, I probably don't want to do this in this case, but let's just see what happens. If I come across to my color board now, let's select inside the mask, which is just dealing with this area here. If I want to push my exposure slightly, that's going to make it a little misty. So let's change that back to 0. Let's just push my highlights a little bit. So that's just going to push in my highlights. And what I could do is outside, which would be down the bottom here, and the sky at the top, what I could do is just pull my midtones down slightly. You can see that's just creating a slight vignette just into my area of focus. And then one more quickly. What we can do is say we've got this first clip here, a lot of beautiful oranges and pinks in the sky. But let's say, for example, that they are looking a little too fierce for me for some reason. So if we come back outside here, because I've dragged it across, here's my second color corrector. If I hit on this mask icon now, I can say add a color mask. And this gives me a little eyedropper. And with this, I can click and drag and select areas. So say I want to just deal with these pinks here. I've just selected those pinks, and you can see the color it's selected in the little box here. And if I come across, I can say, for the pinks specifically, maybe I want to bring down those midtones just a touch, and maybe I want to push the saturation into those midtones just a little bit to sort of bring some of the pinks out as well. And you can see what's happened here, just very subtle. It's just darkened that down and mooded it down so it matches with those oranges. Just a subtle little move like that. And with that, what I've done is I've made sure that all my clips now have a primary and a secondary grade on them. And obviously I could go into a lot more detail. I normally would spend more time than this, but this just gives you an idea of how I'm sort of balancing the contrast and the saturation and the luminance of all these clips. And then I'm dialing in areas I want you to focus on, or fixing different areas of exposure within that clip with my secondary grade. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to create your own LUTs. And to do that, we're going to just put the playhead over the first clip, go File, Share, and Save Current Frame. And what this is going to do is just save out just a still frame, a still shot, just as a JPEG. Let me check my settings. Yep, JPEG image. Just the first frame is going to save as a JPEG. So I'm just going to put this on my desktop. I'm going to move my playhead to the second one. I'm going to go Share, Save Current Frame. I'm going to make this frame 2. And when I'm doing this with a whole project, I'm obviously not saving out every single frame from every single clip. But what I do want to do is get a spread of different frames under different lighting conditions and different looks. And you'll see why in a minute. So let's make this frame 3. So I'm just going to continue to save these out, and I will see you in a minute in Photoshop. Okay, so we're here in Photoshop. I've just created a canvas and I've dragged on my 6 clips from my film that I'm working on. And if I've got a timeline of, 20 minutes plus and 100 shots, I'm still only going to choose 5 or 6 just to give me an overview and to see what the LUT that I'm going to create is going to do to the shots over the whole piece. The great thing about Photoshop is if you come down to your adjustment layers here, most of the things in your adjustment layer here, if you apply it to these images without any masks or anything that's specific to the image, but just as a global adjustment, you can translate and export that as a LUT, which you can then easily apply in Final Cut and most other video editing programs. So let's go ahead and just create, let's start with a curves layer on top here, and just let's create a basic contrast curve. And I'm watching very closely, I'm watching my highlights and I'm watching my shadows across all these clips. So a little bit more contrast, and say I want to just fade out my shadows a little bit. I'm going to drag my bottom piece here and just pull up just a little bit just to add a touch of fade, and then maybe pull my shadows down a little bit there, and maybe I want to fade out my highlights just a touch as well. So I'm going to pull my my white point down just a little bit. Okay, that should, let's turn that on and off just to see what that's done. I like what that's doing. Okay, let's go into my hue and saturation sliders. And again, you've seen me do this on stuff like darkroom. I use the same kind of principles for everything. I want to take out some of my cyans and blues. So I'm going to desaturate some of these blues and cyans a little bit. And let's do the same. I just want to darken down my blues as well. And let's come back to my oranges and my yellow, well, reds and yellows in Photoshop here. So my reds, be very, very careful because I'm already very saturated on this one already. So I'm just going to boost this just a little bit. That's even too much. So let's just say 2, and I'm watching my skin tones as well. That might be a little too much, just 1. And let's see what happens if I brighten these up a little bit as well. Let's just take this to 2 as well. Okay, it's just a little touch on my hue saturation. Let's go to my color balance. On this one, I like to just pull in opposite colors into highlights and shadows just to create a little color contrast, but that doesn't kill any detail. So this is my little formula I often use. Just -3 cyan, this is my shadow selected, and +3 on blue, and that's just going to pull in some cooler tones into my shadows. If I come up to my highlights and do the opposite and go -3 on yellow and +3 on red, and then my mid-tones I might just want to push in -3 on yellows. And let's just have a look. If I turn that layer on and off, you can see it's just created some nice color contrast, but it hasn't lost any of the detail. On top of that, I think I want another curves layer because I'm starting to pull the contrast in quite heavily. So I want to just pull down, without creating a curve, I just want to pull down my highlights a little bit and push up my shadows just a touch. I will create a node here and just set these back, I think, just a little bit, just onto that line. And that's looking quite nice and filmic. So again, if I turn off these adjustments that I've just put on now, you can see that's what I came in with, and just creating a little bit of a look. That's what I'm already creating as a slightly more filmic look. Let's see what else might I want to do. Let's add a photo filter, and this is going to be global. So I think this is sort of too warm and orange. Let's just make sure my color is selected. So I probably want to desaturate this a little bit, but I do like the idea of just warming up the whole image slightly. So I just want to pull in maybe something slightly less saturated, something more almost just golden, but somewhere in the middle. Let's see what that does. If I turn this on and off, yeah, I quite like that. So that's just applying a global kind of palette over the top. I might just pull this to sort of 50%. Let's have a look. Okay, so again, if I take all these off, that's what I came in with, and I'm quite liking how that looks and sort of brings everything together. I think that's looking pretty good. Just going to add a levels layer on top. And a great trick with levels is if I hold down Alt and I click on my highlight end of my levels. Again, levels is your shadows, midtones, highlights. If I pull my highlights to the right, this is going to mean that my white point is going to clip closer, which means I'm losing all the information past this to white. So I'm effectively creating contrast. Again, with the blacks, if I pull it up, everything past here, all this information here on this image has gone to black. But what I can do is if I can hold Alt and I can drag, my screen turns black, but as I drag across with my slider here on the right hand side, you can see the areas that you're losing to white. So again, I can slide it until I'm almost starting to lose some information. So 250 looks pretty good. Again, with the blacks, I can do the same. I'm starting to lose it there. Let's come back. I probably don't want to do this too much. It's too much contrast. So let's just put this at like, let's try 4 here. Yeah, it's going to dial back in some contrast. So that level's great. One more thing I might want to do here is just go to hue saturation, and I might just want to take my saturation just down 5, just to kind of soften everything, make sure everything's not too vibrant. So if I turn everything off again, turn it all back on, that to me is looking good, kind of brings the images together nicely. Okay, last thing you want to do before you export is just select everything that isn't an adjustment layer. So select your top layer, go down to your bottom layer, hold shift and just click everything. And then I want to go right click and then merge layers. So now everything above this is what it's going to export as your LUT. So I'm going to come up to File, Export, come down here to Color Lookup Tables, and I want to call this Lindisfarne. And yeah, 32 medium is absolutely fine. 3DL and Cube. Cube is probably the one that FCPX is going to want to use. And I'm going to go to Desktop here, and I'm going to go to Lindisfarne, Lindisfarne.lut. Let's call it 01 and then save. Okay, back in Final Cut Pro X, I want to go to Window, Workspaces, and I want to go to Default. And then back in Default, I want to click on my little icon here, which is for titles and generators. And this is an adjustment layer, which is just a free plugin I got from Color Grading Central. You can drag this on top of your clips, and the nice thing is you can drag it over your clips, and any correction you make to this layer will apply to anything underneath it. So it's a nice way to kind of make global corrections. Let's open my Effects tab on the right here, and I'm going to come down to, unfortunately, Final Cut Pro X doesn't have a LUT loader built into the program natively, but you can go to Pixel Film Studios and they have a free FCPX LUT loader, which you can download again for free. So I'm going to drag this onto my adjustment layer, and then I'm going to go to Choose External LUT. I'm going to go to my Lindisfarne 01 LUT, which I exported, and there you can see if I turn this on and off, it's applied my LUT, and it's applied it across all these clips. I can turn it on and off here, and I can see what that LUT's doing. It's given it quite a sort of filmic, warm look. And if I say at this stage, I'm like, I like it, but maybe it's too strong, very, very easy in this, and any LUT loader will have similar. You can dial in how much of that LUT you want to see into the image. So on this one, probably I'll just put it at 65 somewhere. And this is just like another opacity sort of slider. But because I've done this mastering layer on top, it's a way to, again, bring all these clips together under an umbrella that sort of makes them feel like one piece. The other little things I probably do is, again, at this stage in this adjustment layer, I probably add some sharpening, any kind of sharpening I wanted to see. I might add just a touch of a vignette, but again, that vignette must be totally invisible. You must never see it or you've messed up, just to sort of pull some center focus in. Little things like that, but otherwise, I think that's looking pretty good. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you need a website or a domain or an online store, they really are a fantastic option. I've used them myself for a good 5-6 years now. If you go and visit my website, that's a Squarespace website. Having a clean, attractive, professional looking website is really, really important to me. I don't want people visiting my website and thinking I'm an amateur because my website looks amateurish. And Squarespace give you a lovely selection of templates designed by top designers that you can use and populate with your content and then be able to tweak really easily in the back end, but not so far that you can mess it up. I'm no techie web guy, I don't know coding or anything like that, but I made some big changes to my website this week. I took down some pages, added some new ones, I added images, took some images out, I changed some text around, and I did this all from someone else's computer just by logging into the back end of Squarespace. So I can do that anywhere in the world, and it took me about 10 to 15 minutes to make those big changes. It wouldn't let me mess anything up too much. It still looks clean, it still looks exactly like my website, but I was able to do it from anywhere in the world. And that kind of flexibility for me is invaluable. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.